I'm Eva Maxwell, and let me tell you a story. My story, one that begins with cranberry sauce still bubbling on the stove and ends with a man alone at the altar, holding a truth he never saw coming. For 23 years, I played my role perfectly. Wife, mother, hostess. I planned holidays down to the linen napkins and stayed up late balancing our checkbook by candlelight when Gregory forgot. I believed in him, in us, even when the little things didn't add up. The late nights, the missed anniversaries, the soft click of his phone turning face down during dinner. I told myself stories to fill the silence, because silence was safer than suspicion. But there's only so much pretending a woman can do before the truth demands to be heard, and when it did, I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I documented, I strategized, I protected everything he thought I'd be too weak to defend. This isn't a tale of heartbreak. It's about what happens when a woman stops begging to be heard and starts building a life where she doesn't need permission. If you're waiting for me to say I forgave him, you'll be disappointed. But if you're here to find out how a quiet housewife turned the tables on a man who tried to erase her, then pull up a chair. Because it started on Thanksgiving Day, and it ended when I wrote my own ending. They say the truth will set you free, but first it burns everything to the ground. The house smelled like sage butter and the kind of nostalgia that wraps around your throat when you're trying to smile through something heavy. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. No gifts, no pressure, just food and family. At least, that's what I used to believe. That morning, I was up before the sun. The turkey had been in the oven since 5. I had hand-mashed the potatoes the way my mother taught me and folded every napkin into perfect little swans. Even the centerpiece, mini pumpkins, autumn leaves, and flickering faux candles had taken me 2 hours to arrange. I told myself it mattered. I told myself that tradition could hold a family together. Gregory had barely looked up from his phone all morning. He sat at the kitchen counter with his ever-present cup of black coffee, scrolling, typing, smirking. I asked him to help move the turkey, and he muttered, "In a minute." That minute never came. Hunter had arrived the night before, looking exhausted but polished in a navy jacket that made him look older than 27. Faith burst through the front door that morning like a gust of joy, arms full of wine bottles and stories from grad school. I watched them settle into the dining room, laughing like siblings do when they forget they're grown. For a brief, dangerous moment, I let myself feel peace. We sat down to eat just after 4. The dining table shimmered under the chandelier, every place setting arranged with care. I carved the turkey while Faith gushed about her thesis, and Hunter complimented the stuffing. Gregory, as always, sat at the head of the table, saying little, drinking steadily. Then came the silence. One of those pauses that shouldn't feel significant, but does. Gregory cleared his throat. I felt the shift in the air before he even stood. "I have something to tell everyone," he said, rising so quickly his chair scraped the hardwood with a shriek. My fork paused mid-air. Faith's wineglass hovered at her lips. Hunter raised an eyebrow. Gregory's voice took on that smooth, businesslike tone I knew too well. It was the voice he used in meetings when he wanted to control the room. "I'm selling the house," he said, like he was announcing we were out of cranberry sauce. "Holly and the kids need more space." At first, I didn't understand. "Holly," he said her name like it belonged at our table. "Jack is 8 now," he continued. "Joel's 6, and Elise just turned 4. They're growing so fast, and her apartment's just too small." Time froze. I heard the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the humming refrigerator, the sound of my heart cracking open. Faith set her glass down too hard. "What? What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice fragile. Gregory smiled like he was sharing good news. "Holly's my girlfriend. We've been together for 8 months. 8 months. I did the math backward. March, spring. The client dinners, the overnight trips to Denver. Hunter's jaw tightened. Faith looked like she might throw up. I didn't say a word. Gregory went on, oblivious. We found a beautiful place in Westfield. 5 bedrooms, big backyard, great schools. The kids will love it. What about Mom? Faith whispered. That was when he finally looked at me. Really looked. I saw it in his eyes, the calculation. He expected a scene, screaming, crying, a slap across the face for dramatic flair. Instead, I stood, quietly walked to the kitchen counter where I'd left my purse. My hands didn't shake. I pulled out the cream-colored envelope I'd carried for weeks. It was heavier than it looked. I walked back to the table, set it beside his plate, right on top of the stain where gravy had spilled during his speech. "Since you're making announcements," I said calmly, "here's mine." Then I sat back down. Picked up my fork, took a bite of sweet potato casserole. It tasted like ash. Gregory stared at the envelope like it might detonate. The confident man who had just announced the dismantling of our family with the ease of reading off a spreadsheet suddenly didn't look so sure. His hand hovered above the flap, then pulled back. "What is it, Dad?" Hunter asked, voice steady but hard as granite. He didn't touch his plate anymore. His gaze didn't leave his father's face. Gregory ran his thumb along the seal. I knew that gesture. It was what he did when he was buying time. When he didn't have the answer, I said nothing. I didn't need to. The room had shifted. Whatever illusion of control Gregory thought he had was gone. Now it was just him, that envelope, and the family he thought he could manipulate like pieces on a chessboard. He cleared his throat again. "Can we not do this here?" Faith blinked at him, confused. "Do what? You just dropped a bomb on us and expect, what, polite applause?" Gregory gave her a warning look, but it didn't land. Not anymore. Hunter leaned back in his chair. "Open it. If you're going to tear our family apart over dessert, the least you can do is read what Mom has to say." Gregory hesitated another second, then finally slipped a finger under the seal. Silence. The rustle of papers. A slow exhale from his lungs. His face went pale as he scanned the contents. Legal documents, notarized and dated, including the deed transfer to the house, now solely in my name. Paperwork I'd filed 3 months earlier, under the radar, with Clayton's guidance. I kept eating. The turkey was tender, the stuffing full of rosemary and just enough dried cherries to surprise the palate. I'd worked too hard for this meal to let his betrayal steal it from me. He looked at me, lips parted. What is this?" "I believe the legal term is preemptive asset protection," I said, dabbing the corner of my mouth with a cloth napkin. "You were planning to sell something you don't own, Gregory. I thought it best to clarify ownership before your new domestic arrangement began." Faith's jaw dropped. "Wait, Mom, you—" "I've been paying attention," I said softly, meeting her eyes, "for longer than you think." Hunter gave a low, admiring whistle. "Holy hell!" Gregory slammed the papers on the table. "You blindsided me." "You announced your affair at Thanksgiving dinner," I replied. "I thought surprises were the theme." His phone buzzed. Loud, jarring, Holly's name flashed across the screen. "Of course." He silenced it quickly, but the damage was done. Faith pushed her plate away, her face crumpling. "You were going to throw us out of our home? For her? For kids that aren't even yours?" Gregory looked cornered now, like a man who had run every light and finally hit a wall. "I was going to take care of everyone," he said. "You, the kids, her kids? I thought we could find a way—" "To do what?" Hunter snapped. "To live a lie. To pretend this house was never ours. That you didn't erase Mom like she was a placeholder?" Gregory stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. "I don't have to sit here and be ambushed in my own—" "In your what?" I said quietly, tilting my head. "Your house?" He froze, and in that breathless pause, I felt it, the balance of power shifting, a quiet coronation. Faith reached across the table and grabbed my hand. Her grip trembled, but her voice was clear. "You knew. You knew this whole time and let him fall into his own trap. I didn't trap anyone, I said. I simply stepped out of the way. Gregory said nothing. His eyes bounced between me and the envelope like he was still trying to rewrite the moment into something less humiliating. But the moment was already printed. Signed. Notarized. He picked up his phone, muttering, "I need some air," and stormed out through the front door, leaving it half open against the November wind. The three of us sat in silence for a beat. Then Hunter reached for the gravy. "Well," he said dryly, "the stuffing's still amazing." We laughed, broken, hesitant, but real, the sound of people starting to remember who they were before they were silenced. And as I looked at my children across that table, the crystal glasses still full, the candles still flickering, I felt something new settle inside me. Not triumph, not even relief. It was clarity. But the night wasn't over yet, because when I went to put away the envelope, I found something else in my purse. Something I hadn't meant to bring. A sealed manila folder labeled D. Elias Martinez, patient file, Gregory Maxwell, confidential. And for the first time in weeks, I smiled. Some files aren't meant to be opened, but once you do, you can't unsee the rot. The folder had a weight to it, not in mass, but in consequence. It lay on the marble countertop the next morning like a sleeping bomb, quiet but poised to blow. The words stamped in red across the label, confidential, seemed to pulse every time I walked past it. I hadn't meant to bring it to Thanksgiving. It was supposed to stay locked in the safe at the office, under my name and Clayton's, under the pretense of legal insurance. But in the chaos of grabbing my purse, the folder must have slipped inside. Or maybe some part of me needed it there. Gregory hadn't come back that night. I half expected him to crawl into bed at 2 a.m. with some twisted excuse and a bouquet of regrets. Instead, the house stayed quiet, as if finally exhaling after years of holding its breath. By sunrise, I was sitting at the kitchen island, coffee in hand, folder in front of me. The kids were still asleep upstairs. The city outside was just starting to thaw from its early winter silence. I flipped it open. Slowly. Inside, a series of typed therapy notes, prescription records, a transcript of a conversation dated 6 months ago. The handwriting was Dr. Martinez's. Steady, clinical, careful. He was a well-known psychiatrist in Westfield with a reputation for handling private clientele. Clayton had insisted I reach out to him after things with Gregory became erratic. What I read made my fingers go numb. There were references to impulse control, rage episodes, feelings of persecution. A line that stood out like it had been written in blood. Patient reports recurring fantasies involving control, erasure, and starting over. But it was the last page that stopped me cold. Patient believes wife is manipulating finances behind his back. Discuss the possibility of committing her to a facility for mental instability. My breath caught. He wasn't just planning to leave. He was planning to erase me, to rewrite the narrative, to weaponize my silence and turn it into a cage. And I'd been smiling through it all, hosting dinner, folding napkins, guarding a home that he'd already decided to burn. I snapped the folder shut just as Hunter walked in, rubbing the back of his neck. He was still in pajama pants, hair a mess, but his eyes were alert. "You didn't sleep?" he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "I didn't want to." He eyed the folder. "Is that about him?" I paused, then slid it toward him. "I think it's time you knew." He sat down beside me, slowly. As he flipped through the pages, his expression shifted. Confusion, disbelief, then something colder. "Jesus," he whispered. "He wanted to have you declared insane?" I nodded again, this time more firmly. "It's not just betrayal, Hunter. It's premeditated, controlled, and he knew what he was doing." We sat in silence for a while, the air thick with everything unspoken. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. "What do you want to do with it?" I looked at him, my son, the boy I raised to be decent, to be kind, to see through masks. And now he was asking me if I was ready to unmask a man he once called Dad. "I want the truth documented," I said slowly, "legally, safely, and I want him to know that I see him for exactly what he is." Hunter nodded. "Clayton? He's already in the loop." Hunter reached for his phone. "I'll start cataloging the evidence. We'll make a digital record, timestamp everything. That way, if anything happens—" "Nothing will happen," I interrupted, more sharply than I intended. "I'm done playing defense. It's time he learned what it feels like to be watched." Hunter didn't flinch. Instead, he gave me a small, grim smile. "Okay then, we play smart." And just like that, we began. Not with revenge, not with chaos, but with order, with facts, with quiet precision. That afternoon, I drove to Clayton's office, folder tucked safely under my coat. The receptionist raised an eyebrow when she saw me, probably because I hadn't booked an appointment. "I won't take long," I said. "He's expecting me." She gestured toward the frosted glass door. "He's in." I stepped inside. Clayton Anderson, sharp suit, tired eyes, stood when he saw me. "Eva," he said, closing his laptop, "is that what I think it is?" I laid the folder on his desk. "It's worse than we thought." Clayton adjusted his glasses, eyes narrowing as he skimmed the top page of the folder. He didn't speak for a full minute. Then he looked up. "This isn't just damning," he said. "It's strategic. He wasn't just planning to leave you, Eva. He was building a case to discredit you, legally, medically." "I know," I said, folding my hands in my lap. "That's why I'm here." Clayton leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his knee. "We'll need corroboration. These notes help, but we need voices. Dates, maybe surveillance." I nodded slowly. "I want to revisit the source, Dr. Martinez. I want to know exactly what Gregory told him, and whether he was complicit or manipulated." Clayton looked uneasy. "He's not known for being cooperative. High-profile clients pay him well for silence." "Then I'll remind him what he swore in his licensing oath," I replied, standing. He didn't stop me. He just offered one sentence on my way out. "Keep a recorder on you." The psychiatric office was housed inside a weathered brownstone near the edge of Westfield. Not flashy, run down, just discreet, the kind of place wealthy families use to fix the kind of things they didn't want anyone else to know about. I hadn't made an appointment. I didn't need one. I walked past the front desk with a nod, as if I still belonged here. The receptionist hesitated, recognition flickering in her eyes, but I gave her no time to question it. My heels clicked down the narrow hallway until I found the familiar brass plate. "Dr. Elias Martinez, MD, board-certified psychiatry." I knocked once and opened the door. Dr. Martinez looked up from his desk, startled. Still the same salt and pepper beard, still the pressed button-down and distant gaze that had made me uneasy the first time I'd met him. "Mrs. Maxwell," he said slowly, standing. "You weren't scheduled." "No," I replied evenly. "But I think you'll want to hear what I have to say." His brow furrowed. "I don't discuss patient files without a release. You already did multiple times. To someone who was not your patient. Me. And now I need answers." His eyes flicked to the recorder I placed on the table between us. I sat without invitation. "6 months ago," I began, "my husband came to you. You documented statements that indicated concern for my mental state. You even recommended commitment under a guardianship clause. I evaluated based on what was presented." "What was presented," I cut in, "was a carefully orchestrated lie. He was preparing to gaslight me out of my marriage, out of my rights, out of my sanity." Martinez shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Maxwell, Gregory Maxwell claimed he was concerned for your well-being. He said you were forgetful. Paranoid." "I wasn't paranoid," I said sharply. "I was aware, and now I'm prepared. I have copies of everything you wrote. And if you don't want a malpractice inquiry dragging your name through the Westfield Times, you'll tell me everything you remember, unofficially." Silence. Then finally he sighed and sat down. "He was persistent," Martinez said quietly. "Charming, persuasive, but something about it felt coached. Too precise. I took notes, but I never formally recommended institutionalization. I told him it would take months of evaluations." "That's not what his lawyer believes," said, placing another document on the desk. "An unsigned draft of a petition for psychiatric hold, dated 2 weeks before Thanksgiving." Martinez paled. "He already had the paperwork ready," I continued. "He just needed you to sign it." He leaned back, visibly shaken. "I never did." "Good," I said, standing. "Because now you're going to give me something else." "The session tapes? He signed consent for recording, didn't he?" "Yes, but they're confidential." He waived confidentiality when he tried to weaponize your words. "Give me the audio or I'll have a subpoena on your doorstep by morning." He stared at me. Then, slowly, he stood and walked to the locked cabinet in the corner. 10 minutes later, I was driving home with a USB drive clenched in my palm like a loaded gun. That night, after the kids were asleep and the house was wrapped in the hush of midnight, I sat at my desk with headphones on, the USB plugged in, the audio crackled, then Gregory's voice came through. Confident, casual, deceptive. "And if she resists, we'll say she's delusional. We've got the paper trail. The kids won't question it. They love me too much." My hand tightened around the armrest. My heartbeat turned to thunder. Then another voice, one I hadn't expected. "What about her father's will? If she finds it—" Gregory laughed, low and smug. She won't. I buried that secret a long time ago. Eva Maxwell doesn't know who she really is. They say the dead can't speak, but my father had left behind a voice louder than any scream. It just took me 23 years to hear it." I replayed Gregory's words again and again, each syllable stripping away what I thought I knew about my life. "She doesn't know who she really is." That sentence haunted me more than the betrayal. Because if Gregory had been lying about my mind, what else had he buried? Growing up, I'd believed my father. Charles Whitmore died of a stroke when I was 10. My mother, no, Judith, I corrected myself, had made it sound sudden, tragic, but natural. We never talked about it after the funeral. The house went quiet. I was sent to boarding school, and when I returned, Gregory was already there, smiling, helping, replacing. Now, I wasn't sure if anything about that time had been real. Clayton didn't flinch when I played him the recording, but I saw the way his jaw clenched and his eyes darkened. "If what he said about your father's will is true," he murmured, "then Gregory's cover-up isn't just about your reputation. It's financial. Criminal." "Can we find it?" I asked. Clayton leaned back. "If your father did write a will and it was buried, someone helped him do it, and I know where to start." The Legal Archives building in Trenton, New Jersey wasn't glamorous, but it was thorough. Decades of estate filings, probate records, and affidavits were stored in its temperature-controlled belly, meticulously logged but rarely accessed, unless someone died without a plan. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped through the yellowed folders, tracing my father's name down a brittle index. Nothing under Maxwell. But then, Whitmore, Charles A., a sealed envelope, handwritten filing note from 1999, no executor listed, no probate case completed. I turned to Clayton, who had followed me inside under the pretense of paralegal assistance. "This was never processed," I whispered. "That means it was filed but blocked," he said. "Someone pulled strings." I opened the envelope. Inside, a single-page last will and testament, naming me, the 10-year-old Eva Whitmore, as the sole heir to a trust held in my father's name, with 2 witnesses, and a postscript. "In the event of my death, contact attorney Thomas Harrington, Newark." "You're sure this is the man?" I asked, staring at the faded business card still tucked into the folder. Clayton nodded. He was known for representing clients in private estate matters, especially ones that needed to be handled discreetly. The drive to Newark was quiet. My mind replayed fragments from my childhood I had long shelved, the way my father used to write letters late at night, the mysterious visitors in suits. The time I caught Gregory reading my dad's notebooks and he told me it was just boring adult stuff. Attorney Thomas Harrington turned out to be 82 years old, retired, and living in a modest senior complex that smelled faintly of peppermint and old mahogany. He opened the door slowly, cane in hand, but his eyes were sharp. "You look like your father," he said immediately. "Which one are you? Emily?" "Eva," I said softly, his daughter. Something shifted in his posture, curiosity tempered with regret. "I knew this day would come," he said, stepping aside. "Come in." His living room was cluttered with legal journals and piles of handwritten case notes. "I filed the will," he said. "Your father insisted it remain sealed until you turned 25, or unless someone contested the estate. Gregory, he tried. But the conditions of the trust were airtight, so instead of fighting it legally, he buried it socially. He made sure you never knew." I sat forward. "How?" "Fake paperwork, friends in court, and a very persuasive wife." "Judith," he nodded. "She told me you were unstable, that releasing the trust would endanger you. I didn't believe her, but I had no legal standing after your father's death was ruled natural." My voice was tight. Was it natural? Mr. Harrington paused. "I never saw the body. I only saw the death certificate. It was signed quickly, too quickly." My hands balled into fists in my lap. "Do you still have your copies of the trust documentation?" "I do," he said, "and I'll give them to you, on one condition." I looked up. "When you take Gregory down," he said, voice low and steady, "you expose everything. Don't just reclaim what's yours. Reclaim your name." I didn't rush. If there's one thing grief and betrayal teaches you, it's patience. While Gregory and Judith scrambled to keep up their public image, I was assembling mine piece by piece. And the first piece? A return that didn't look like vengeance. It looked like grace. I RSVP'd to the Maxwell Foundation's annual gala with one word: attending. No fanfare, no contact beforehand. I wanted them to see me before they could prepare for me. Clayton tried to hide his amusement as he watched me choose a dress, a sleek black column with a high slit and low back. "You sure you don't want something less lethal?" "Gregory always liked his women muted," I said, slipping a diamond stud into one ear. "Tonight? I'm not his wife. I'm a Whitmore." The ballroom at the Hamilton Estate Hotel glittered in chandeliers and hollow laughter. I stood near the entrance just long enough for the whispers to begin. "Is that—" "No, it can't be her. She left town." Judith saw me first. Her martini glass froze halfway to her lips. "Eva," she said with a smile that could curdle milk. "What a surprise. I heard the foundation was doing well," I replied evenly. "I wanted to see what my former home is funding these days." "You rested. Divorce will do that to you." She blinked, smile slipping an inch. "Gregory didn't mention you were back?" I smiled sweetly. "I didn't mention it to Gregory." That's when he appeared, holding a tumbler of something expensive and aged. He froze mid-step. I watched his throat tighten, just briefly, before he plastered on that familiar charm. "Eva," he said, reaching to touch my elbow. "This is unexpected." I didn't move. "Isn't it, though?" Dinner was served. I let them think I was just visiting, just watching, let them believe I had nothing but nostalgia and bitterness in my veins. But after dessert, when the foundation chair began thanking donors, I made my move. I rose quietly and stepped up to the microphone. "If I could just say a few words," I began, watching the flicker of alarm dance behind Gregory's eyes. "I want to thank the Maxwell family for everything they've done. For this city, for the arts, for the community." I let the crowd's polite applause settle before I continued. "I especially want to thank Charles Whitmore," I said, "my father, a man who believed in truth and who left me something far more valuable than money." The room stilled. "He left me clarity," And then I walked off the stage, leaving them all blinking in silence. Outside, on the balcony, I lit a cigarette. I didn't smoke. But I remembered how Judith did when she was nervous. I wanted her to see me holding fire. Within minutes, Gregory followed. "What the hell are you doing?" I turned slowly, returning. "You have no right to show up and make veiled threats." "Threats?" I laughed quietly. "Gregory, if I wanted to threaten you, I would have brought the documents, the real ones." His face darkened. "You don't know what you're getting into." "Oh, but I do. I know everything now, about the trust, about my father, about you." He leaned in, voice tight. "That trust is gone." "No," I said calmly. "It was sealed, illegally suppressed, and I have proof." His face blanched, and, before you ask, yes, I spoke with Thomas Harrington. He stepped back, swearing under his breath. I exhaled slowly. "I'm not here to destroy you, Gregory, not yet. I'm here to give you a choice." He scoffed. "A choice?" I smiled. "You either come forward and admit what you've done, or I let the world find out the way it always does, messily." That night, I didn't sleep. I watched the old video again, the one I'd recovered from my father's camcorder tapes that Judith had conveniently lost. It showed a picnic, me at 9 years old in a red sundress, and in the corner, Gregory, standing beside my mother, whispering too close. There was something about the way he looked at her. Possessive. Familiar. I paused the tape, heart thudding, and suddenly I remembered something Judith once said when she thought I was asleep. "You're more his than you know." What if Gregory wasn't just my stepfather? What if the betrayal ran deeper, into blood, into lies that began long before my father's death? It started with a name I hadn't heard in over a decade. Dr. Elias Martinez. And like all secrets kept too long, this one didn't knock. It kicked the door open. After watching that tape over and over, I knew what I needed. Confirmation. Not speculation, not memories clouded by time or emotion. I needed evidence, undeniable, clinical, and cold. The kind that doesn't flinch under a courtroom spotlight. Clayton and I sat in his office the next morning, legal pads spread out like maps on a war table. "This is the man who signed off on your mother's prenatal records," he said, pointing to a scan of old medical documents I'd pulled from the storage unit. "Dr. Elias Martinez, OB/GYN, retired, moved to Vermont." I hadn't spoken to him since my father's funeral, and I remembered why. He looked at me like I was a puzzle only half solved. 3 days later, I stood outside a modest cedar cabin nestled among sugar maple trees in Montpelier. Vermont in late fall was beautiful, unbearably so. The colors looked like they were trying too hard to distract you from the cold. He answered the door slower than I expected, but his eyes were sharp, cautious. "Eva Maxwell," he said. Or should I say, Eva Whitmore? "I'm not here to reminisce," I said. "I need the truth." Dr. Martinez didn't blink. "And what if it hurts?" "I've already been hurt. What I need now is clarity." He poured tea in silence, hands shaking slightly, but his voice was steady when he began. "Your mother came to me in late 1989. She was scared, not of being pregnant, but of who would find out." I held my breath. She wasn't married to Charles yet. She said it was complicated, that there were expectations that someone in the family could know. I leaned forward. "Who?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he pushed a worn envelope across the table. Inside were copies of old test results, hormone levels, ultrasounds, and one sealed envelope marked "Confidential Paternity Test Requested by Patient." I stared at it. This was never in any hospital file I found. She asked me to keep it off record and said she'd decide what to do later. My fingers trembled as I opened the results. One name jumped off the page: Gregory Maxwell. Probability of paternity 99.8%. My heart didn't race. It stopped. I sat there, holding proof that the man who raised me, who married my mother, who destroyed everything in her name, wasn't just my stepfather. He was my biological father. The room tilted slightly. The floor didn't move, but I did. I stood too quickly, knocking over the tea. Dr. Martinez reached forward. She wanted to protect you. She thought Charles could give you a better name, a safer legacy. I wasn't angry. I was hollow. I had spent years mourning my father, Charles Whitmore, idolizing him. And now I realized he might have known and chosen to love me anyway. I need a copy of this, I said. I figured you would. He handed me a second sealed envelope. Be careful, Eva. Some people kill to bury bloodlines. Back in the car, I sat behind the wheel for nearly 20 minutes before turning the ignition. A thin fog had rolled in, curling around the windshield like fingers. I could still feel the pulse in my wrists, erratic and defiant. I wasn't crying, not yet. My tears had learned to wait their turn. Instead, I drove. South. Toward Massachusetts. Toward answers. Toward the woman who had once whispered at my bedside, "He doesn't know the full truth. And he never will." Judith. If Judith knew all along, then who else did? And why did she work so hard to keep me away from everything that once belonged to my mother? Judith always had a way of answering the door like she'd been expecting a storm. And that day, I was the thunder. The Maxwell estate in Cape Cod hadn't changed in decades. Same manicured hedges, same wrought iron gate, same ocean breeze scented with lavender Judith insisted on planting every spring. Only now, I saw it differently. Not as home, but as a fortress of curated lies. She opened the door in silk. Always silk. "Eva," she said, her voice flat like old champagne. "What a surprise. Not really," I replied, stepping past her before she could decide whether to allow it. The foyer echoed as I walked through it. My footsteps felt like defiance. Judith followed slowly, letting her heels click with meaning. "I assume this is not a social call," she said. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You've been digging. I met with Dr. Martinez." That name pulled the breath from her lungs, and I watched the tiniest flinch behind the cheekbones she held so high. She recovered fast, but I already saw it. "And?" she asked coolly. I pulled the envelope from my coat pocket and tossed it onto the marble console table. It landed with a slap that reverberated deeper than sound. Her hand hovered above it, then slowly drew back. "You knew," I whispered, "you knew Gregory was my father, and you let me believe Charles Whitmore was. You let me mourn him." Judith didn't deny it. Instead, she crossed the room and poured herself a drink. "You were a child," she said. "You needed structure, and Charles provided that. Status, resources, a name that mattered. Gregory was. Never meant to be permanent. But he was. He is." She turned then, glass in hand, eyes icy. "Yes. And that is precisely why this conversation is dangerous." "Dangerous for who?" I demanded. "Me? Or the legacy you and Gregory built on secrets?" There was a silence. A heavy, careful pause that filled the room like fog. She finally spoke, voice low. "You don't know what it cost to protect you. Your mother was unstable near the end. She would have exposed everything. And Gregory, he has enemies, Eva. Not all of them wear suits. That doesn't justify any of this." "No, but it explains it." I walked toward her, closing the space between our two truths. "Why was I really sent to boarding school at 14? Her eyes didn't blink. "Because you were asking too many questions. About your birth, about your mother. You were unraveling." "So you exiled me?" I said bitterly. She nodded once. "And you thrived. You built a life. But now you've come back to rip everything apart." I didn't respond right away. I looked around. At the family portraits, the urn on the shelf labeled Charles Whitmore, and the stained glass window my mother used to stand in front of every Sunday morning like a makeshift church. "You're wrong," I said, softly. "I didn't come back to destroy. I came back to reclaim what was stolen. I left the envelope behind, let her stew in the numbers, let her wonder who I'd show it to next. When I stepped outside, the wind cut sharp against my face, but I didn't flinch. Judith had always seemed untouchable, invulnerable. But today, she blinked, she faltered. That meant something. Back in the car, I dialed Clayton. "Get ready," I said. "We're filing the inheritance claim next week." He paused. "You sure?" "Absolutely. I have medical proof. My mother's original will is next." How will the family react? They won't have time to. Not until it's too late. And just as I hung up the call, an email notification appeared on my dashboard screen. From an anonymous address. Subject: "You're not the only one digging." Attachment: video _1994 living room MP4. My stomach dropped. Who else had a stake in this secret? And what the hell was in that video? Sometimes, the truth doesn't come with fireworks. It arrives in grainy video and static-laced silence. That's how the past found me, through a flickering screen in the dark. I sat alone in my apartment, blinds drawn, the city outside too loud for what I was about to see. The anonymous email had only one sentence: "Watch it alone." The file, video _1994 living room, MP4, was just over 3 minutes. But I felt like I aged 20 years watching it. The scene was ordinary, the old living room at the Whitmore estate. My mother, young, vibrant, and very much alive, paced across the frame, clutching a folder. She looked frantic, desperate. Then Gregory entered. No smile, no affection, just tension so thick you could hear it through the decades. "You promised," she screamed. "Gregory! Lower your voice, Eleanor. I kept your child, Gregory. I lied to my husband for you, and now you want to cut me off?" She waved the folder. "You made me sign this. A will that gives everything to Judith if I die under unusual circumstances. You think I didn't read it?" And then, the moment she stepped too close, Gregory grabbed her wrist. Something snapped, not physically, but emotionally. Her voice cracked. "You're not going to hurt me. I won't let you." But the video cut off before I could see what happened next. I stared at the paused screen. My hands were trembling. Eleanor Whitmore, my mother, wasn't mentally unstable. She wasn't paranoid. She was cornered. And someone sent me this video now for a reason. I forwarded it to Clayton immediately. "Where did this come from?" he asked during our call. "I don't know," I said. "Anonymous." He was silent a beat. Then, "This changes everything. If we can link this to her original will, we have grounds to contest the estate, expose the fraud, and press for a criminal inquiry." I closed my laptop slowly. Good. Because I'm done reacting. It's time I start dictating how this ends. That night, I went to see Diana. We hadn't spoken since Thanksgiving. She was still reeling from Gregory's public declaration. I found her sitting alone in her art studio, glass of wine in hand, surrounded by half-finished canvases that looked like they'd been attacked more than painted. She didn't speak at first, just looked at me. Then, finally, "So, it's true? You're suing the family?" "No," I said. "I'm correcting history." Diana set down her glass. "You really think Mom was murdered?" "I don't know yet. But I know she was silenced. And I intend to make her voice heard." She looked tired, defeated. "They'll destroy you, Eva. You know that, right? Gregory, Judith, even Marcus. They'll make you the villain." "I've been the villain in their story since I was 14, I said. "I can survive being hated. What I can't survive is knowing the truth and doing nothing." Back in my car, I stared at the mirror longer than I needed to. Not to check my makeup, but to look into the eyes of the woman I was becoming. Eva Maxwell, socialite wife and dutiful daughter, was gone. What remained was something else. Something forged in betrayal, grief, and clarity. The next morning, I did what I hadn't dared for years. I walked into the Boston Herald's downtown newsroom and handed an envelope to investigative journalist Renee Markham. "This is off the record for now," I said, "but if anything happens to me, this goes public." She opened the envelope. I saw her eyes scan the sills from the video, copies of my DNA report, and Eleanor's signed letter that I'd recovered from her safety deposit box. Renee looked up slowly. "You're not messing around." "No," I said. "Not anymore." Renee Markham didn't waste time. Within 72 hours, her team had begun quietly pulling property records, cross-referencing Eleanor's sealed medical files, and, most significantly, tracking down Martha Elkins, the Whitmore family's former housekeeper who vanished just weeks after my mother's funeral. Clayton was skeptical at first. "She left 23 years ago, Eva. She might not want to be found." "She left," I corrected him, "because someone wanted her gone. It was Renee's interns who finally got a lead, a Martha E. listed as a nurse's aide in rural Vermont. I drove there myself. When I arrived at the modest retirement home, I was prepared for a woman hardened by time, but the frail figure in the corner lounge wasn't what I expected. She looked scared, not stubborn. "Martha?" I asked gently. Her eyes darted to the staff desk, then back to me. "Who sent you?" "No one," I said, "but I think you knew my mother, Eleanor Whitmore." The color drained from her face. She closed her eyes, then whispered, "She didn't fall down those stairs." The words sat between us like glass shards. "I believe you," I said, "but I need more. A statement. Anything." Martha hesitated. "I kept something. I didn't know why back then, just instinct." She motioned for her handbag and pulled out an old microcassette recorder, its label peeling but still legible. "July 12, that kitchen." She placed it in my hand. "I heard them fighting that night. Gregory and Judith. Your mother was alive when I left the room. When I came back, she wasn't. I drove back to Boston with the recorder resting on my passenger seat like it was a lit stick of dynamite. At Clayton's office, we played the tape. The quality was poor, but the voices were unmistakable. Gregory. If she opens her mouth, we both go down. Judith. Then make sure she doesn't. There was a scuffle, a slam, then silence. Clayton sat back, rubbing his temples. "We have motive, we have threat. We're missing only one thing. Cause of death. Without that, they'll call it circumstantial." "But they won't be able to silence this," I said. "Not anymore." Meanwhile, the press started circling. Though Renee hadn't published yet, whispers spread in social circles, especially after I attended the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala in a red velvet gown, alone, without Gregory on my arm. The dress wasn't just fashion, it was war paint. Judith approached me halfway through the event, champagne flute in hand, smile tight as wire. "You look revived," she said. "I am," I replied. "Turns out, truth is the best facial." She narrowed her eyes. "You're playing a dangerous game, Eva. I learnt from the best." Later that evening, as I stepped outside into the crisp night air, Renee called. "Martha's been admitted to the ER," she said. "Possible stroke. But the doctor said something strange. She was brought in by a man claiming to be her nephew. Except she doesn't have one." I froze. "You think it was Gregory?" "I don't know," Renee said. "But whatever's on that tape, it's got someone spooked." I looked up at the full moon. The night felt too still, too staged. "Martha's the only witness we have," I whispered. "If she dies, that tape becomes hearsay." Renee paused, then said, "Then you better make sure she doesn't. They say the truth sets you free, but first it ruins you." I didn't sleep the night after Martha was hospitalized. The fear that someone had reached her before I could get her full statement gnawed at me. Every shadow looked like Gregory. Every silence screamed Judith's name. Clayton filed for a formal inquiry the next morning, submitting the tape, supporting records, and a petition to unseal Eleanor's autopsy. Meanwhile, Renee handed me a single folder, thinner than I expected. Inside, the original inheritance revision Eleanor requested a month before her death, naming me as sole trustee of the Whitmore legacy. It had never gone through. Gregory blocked it, claiming she was mentally unfit. But the same argument they would now face, except this time, it was on my terms. I walked into the Boston family court just before noon, every eye in the room turning toward me. I wore black, not for mourning, but for clarity. My life in color had ended the day Eleanor was buried under a lie. Judith sat across the aisle, her posture as upright as a queen in exile. Gregory wasn't beside her. He had retained separate counsel. The unraveling had begun. The judge asked if I had anything to present before testimony. I stood, voice steady. Yes, Your Honor, a tape, a timeline, and a pattern of silencing the truth for 23 years. When the audio played, Judith's face drained. She didn't blink once. But Gregory? Gregory closed his eyes as if the words were knives. Then make sure she doesn't. That sentence echoed in the still courtroom like a confession written in fire. After court adjourned, Marcus cornered me outside. He knows it's over, he said. Gregory's already talking plea deals. And Judith? But even that can't clean blood. We stood in silence. Then he asked, "Do you feel better?" It was a strange question, one I hadn't allowed myself to consider. I'd survived, yes. I'd uncovered everything they tried to bury with my mother. But better? I didn't know what that felt like anymore. That evening, I returned to Eleanor's townhouse. It had been locked for over 2 decades, its keys kept hidden inside a file labeled estate, not in use. Now I held them in my hand, the metal warm from my palm. Inside, everything smelled like aged paper and lavender. Her scent. I didn't cry when I found her old writing desk. I opened the drawers one by one, like unraveling layers of a woman I only knew in fractured memories. In the final drawer was a sealed envelope. "To Eva, when you're ready." I tore it open with shaking fingers. The letter was short. "You will face cruelty and be asked to shrink. Don't. The name you carry is not a burden, it's a mirror. When you hold it up to the world, they will see who they are. And who you are, my love, is mine. Live fully. Fight wisely. Trust your instincts. The legacy isn't a house or fortune. It's the voice you choose to use." I sat there for what felt like hours, letter against my heart. She had known. Somehow, Eleanor had known they would come for her voice, and tried to give me mine. That night, I walked into my own apartment and, for the first time in months, exhaled. I poured myself a glass of wine, I turned on the music, and I danced, not for celebration, but for survival, for reclaiming space, for remembering I was still alive. Until the doorbell rang. I hadn't seen Amelia cry like that since her 5th grade piano recital, when the pedal jammed mid-piece and she froze under the spotlight. But this wasn't a child's disappointment. This was something heavier. Something real. She handed me the crumpled paper. It was a copy of the revised trust agreement, the one Eleanor had tried to file weeks before her death, but this one had a signature date 2 days after she was declared deceased. I blinked. "Where did you get this?" "It was in Dad's death drawer," Amelia said, voice cracking. "I wasn't looking for anything, I swear. I needed a charger, and then I saw the name. Yours." My breath caught. He hadn't just suppressed the original document. He'd attempted to forge a replacement, posthumously, as if he wanted to control Eleanor's voice from beyond the grave, as if her death hadn't been enough silence for him. "I didn't know he was capable of this," Amelia said, her knuckles white around the glass of water I'd handed her. "I did. I'd always known. But it's one thing to suspect, and another to hold the proof in your hands." The next morning, Clayton took the copy to the probate court. With it, the official investigation into Gregory Maxwell's financial fraud and document tampering reopened, this time under criminal jurisdiction. Judith lawyered up again, but no one was offering her immunity now. Her inner circle had already begun to fracture. One by one, old allies turned into cautious observers. By the time the Boston Herald ran the headline, "Whitmore Estate Tied to Forgery Scandal," the fall from grace had already begun. And I, quietly, methodically, began dismantling what remained of their control. I revoked the joint accounts. I legally restored Eleanor's maiden name to all properties tied to the trust. I met with the Whitmore Foundation board and announced a new initiative, the Eleanor Project, aimed at supporting women rebuilding after legal and financial abuse. Some flinched at the announcement. Others applauded. A few stared at me like I'd become someone else entirely. But I hadn't. I'd simply become who I was always meant to be. 1 week later, I visited Gregory at the county detention center. He looked thinner, angrier. His eyes still held that spark of arrogance until he saw me place the forged document on the glass between us. His lips parted. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He just said, "You've made your point." "No," I said softly. "You did. When you thought I'd never be brave enough to fight back. When you assumed I'd crumble the moment you walked away." He stared, then laughed. "So what now, you want revenge?" I leaned in, expression calm. "I already have it. This visit, it's not for you. It's for me, to know I faced the man who tried to erase me and left without a scratch." That night, as I watched the city lights blink from my balcony, a familiar voice called behind me, "Mom!" Amelia stood there, holding her suitcase. "I broke the lease," she said simply, and I applied to a grad program in Vermont. Something about helping women like us. Like Grandma. I smiled. We didn't say much more that night. We didn't need to. Thanks so much for watching Family and Heart Stories. If this story touched you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more heartfelt dramas every week.